Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. Welcome to another episode of Building the Bridge. And I have the honor and privilege of being with Tiffany Comprés today, international arbitration and litigation attorney based in Miami and in Paris. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, a more general question, but a very, very important one. Why is international law important to international business?
Oh man, so many reasons. Primarily, you need to understand when you're doing business internationally that there are international laws that can apply to your business that cover specific areas or specific kinds of businesses. For example, there is a law called the UN Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods that governs international sales of goods between business people or between companies. So whenever one company is selling goods to another as part of a distribution, as for any other reason, this specific law will cover that unless the contract specifically says otherwise. And one important caveat to note is that if the contract says Florida law applies, that is not enough. You have to affirmatively exclude this treaty in order for
Wow,
it to not apply, which a lot of people don't know.
that's why you're here with us, is for us to learn new things. That's a really important point.
Exactly. So you need to know because these laws are typically very different from the domestic laws that the parties might be used to. There, for example, this particular treaty I was talking about, we call it the CISG because its whole name is very long. The CISG was negotiated in the 70s by a group of 45 countries. So everybody sent an emissary, they debated, they discussed. There are lots of writings on what went on and how the CISG as we know it today has come to be. It was enacted or it was ratified first in 1980, and now there are 68 countries that have ratified this treaty. So by and large, if you are buying and selling goods, if you are importing and exporting as a business, this international treaty applies to your deal. So it would behoove you to get familiar with it, right? When can I cancel a shipment? Can I cancel a shipment if the guy says, he's not going to pay me, or if I happen to find out that he's insolvent, right? What happens if the product gets to me and it's defective? What if that product is perishable? Is there a timeline? Do I have to let them know that there's a defect within a certain period of time? All of these issues are covered in this law and might be extremely different from the domestic rules that parties and businesses might be used to.
Does it matter which countries you're dealing with and whether they have ratified this or not? You said 68, so that leaves 140 other countries that have not necessarily.
Yes, that is true. One of the big outliers, for example, is England. But it does matter. There are a couple of ways that it can come to apply. If both countries have ratified, right? If the buyer and seller are each from countries that have ratified the treaty applies.
Right.
If they have a contract and the contract says the law of X country applies, and that country has ratified the treaty, then the treaty applies.
So the negotiation of these contracts is hugely important. You have to.
Yes, absolutely, without question.
Otherwise, you're exposing your, let's say this is one of your clients. If you didn't have one of those countries involved, and that would expose your clients in a way, right? You expose them to potential problems that they could not solve, or would it have to then go to arbitration and you would be able to help with that?
Well, this convention doesn't talk about arbitration or litigation, right? So they would have to have a separate clause to deal with how they resolve their disputes. But wherever they resolve their dispute, the question is what law applies and would this treaty apply? Let's say, for example, you're talking about a deal between one party that's from a ratifying country and one party that's from a non-ratifying country, and the deal doesn't say the governing law. Then what do you do? right? In some situations, it could be that the treaty applies, and in some situations it doesn't. There are countries that have in their ratification added essentially a note. We call it a declaration
Okay.
that says if the rules of private international law lead to the application of the CISG, that's fine or that's not fine. So in some countries, for example, just saying that the law of X country applies because, for example, the governing law would be the law of the seller, even though they don't have a contract, but for whatever reason, the law of the seller applies, and that country has ratified the CISG may still not apply because the other, that country has signed in their ratification, they also included a declaration when they signed the treaty saying that applying the treaty because of private international law is not enough.
Wow. Okay.
It's complicated. It's more complicated than it looks like at the outset.
So how do you convince someone to actually buy and sell goods if it's just so complicated?
People don't know about this. And in the United States, lawyers are not trained on international law as a matter of course. In Europe, you see a lot more attorneys that are familiar with this law. What happens is that oftentimes people will litigate a CISG issue without at all applying the correct law. They'll apply domestic law, and then the outcome is incorrect. So that's what I see happen most of the time. The other thing that I see happen is that corporate attorneys who are not very familiar with this law will just exclude it in the contract, which is fine, but it may not really be the most beneficial thing for the client. What I tend to do is I look at the deal, I analyze the situation, I consider what position my client is in the deal, whether it would be beneficial or not to have the treaty in general.
Okay.
And then I will exclude certain clauses that I don't want to apply. And you can absolutely do that under the CISG.
So a take home really is because of the incredible layered complexity of all this, not only in the document between the two companies, but just the governing laws and treaties and conventions, etc. It's extremely important to put in as much time and care into the formation documents. The formation meaning the formation or the binding of companies in specific deals, right? These deal memos and whatever other documents are signed, you have to literally go over with a fine-tooth comb, and you have to tailor it to those specific, not only the details of the business deal, but also the countries that are involved, correct?
Exactly. And I think I may have misspoken. I think I said 65, there are 85 countries that have ratified that particular treaty. But there are also other treaties that apply to different issues. There are tax treaties that may apply in certain areas of a business, right? There are all kinds of treaties. So that the takeaway, as you said, is when you're doing international business, have somebody that's very knowledgeable in international law take a look at what you're proposing to do and advise you as to, whether you might need to do it a little bit differently or tailor the contract to make sure that you're in the best position.
Yeah, I think for our viewers' edification, there's hyper specialized lawyers in the U.S. not only by the actual content that they're working on, but also by state, and so they tend to be very domestic in nature. And then in civil code countries, obviously there are a lot of generalists who it's impossible when you're doing 20 different kinds of things to be also adding international law knowledge to your repertoire. So that's where people like you really come in handy,
That's precisely right.
So how do people get in touch with you who appreciate that if they're doing international business, they need to work with an international lawyer like you?
They can reach me at my email. I'm always attentive to my email, and that's tiffany.compress@fisherbroyles.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge today, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me.